When Andrew Keller, the dependable mailman of Maplewood, approached the familiar house on Elm Street that morning, he expected another quiet stop on his routine delivery route. But when the elderly woman who lived there opened the door, something was terribly wrong. Dark bloodstains streaked her clothes, and her once cheerful face was gaunt and distant. What Andrew saw inside her home, and the unsettling odor that lingered in the air, would lead him to make a call that would change everything. This is the story of how a simple mailman's concern saved a life. Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. We bring you real stories that remind us how important it is to look out for one another. Also, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? It's incredible to see how these stories bring people together from all over the world. The first light of dawn was just creeping over the rooftops when Andrew Keller, a 34-year-old mailman, slipped into his blue uniform and prepared for the day ahead. For the last 6 years, Andrew had traversed the same quiet streets of Maplewood, delivering mail to the familiar houses. His job gave him more than just a paycheck. It was a connection to the community, a bond forged through routine greetings, small conversations, and the simple act of being there every day. Andrew liked the predictability of his route, the quiet rhythm that came with the sunrise, and the routine of delivering letters and packages. He knew every corner, every well-tended lawn, and every resident along his path. This particular morning, however, something gnawed at him as he climbed into his mail truck. It had been 2 weeks since he'd last seen Mrs. Irene Callahan. Mrs. Callahan, an elderly widow in her mid-80s, lived alone in a charming house on Elm Street. She was the sort of neighbor who always offered Andrew a smile and a glass of lemonade on hot summer days, the type who knew everyone in the neighborhood by name. But recently, her porch had been empty, and her mailbox had started overflowing with letters and newspapers. The last time Andrew had seen her, she had mentioned feeling a bit under the weather, but nothing seemed alarming at the time. Still, her absence had begun to weigh on him. As Andrew's truck rolled to a stop outside Mrs. Callahan's house, his stomach knotted with a sense of unease. The lawn, once perfectly maintained, was overgrown with weeds. A stack of yellowed newspapers lay strewn across the front steps, untouched. He stared at the house, wondering if Mrs. Callahan was still inside, and if she was, why she hadn't collected her mail in days. His instincts told him to check on her. Andrew grabbed the small package addressed to her and walked up the path. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves, and the crisp autumn morning seemed colder than usual. When he reached the door, he rang the bell twice, his hand lingering on the button as if that would speed up her response. Nothing. He knocked firmly on the door, waiting. A minute passed, then 2. Still nothing. He was about to leave a note when, to his surprise, the door creaked open just a few inches. Andrew froze. Through the small gap, Mrs. Callahan stood there, leaning against the doorframe, her frail body barely supporting her weight. Her once tidy gray hair hung in limp strands around her face, and her eyes seemed distant, as if struggling to focus on him. But what shocked Andrew the most were the dark red stains on her pants, spreading from her waist down to her thighs. "Mrs. Callahan?" he asked softly, his voice tight with concern. "Are you all right?" She didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was weak, barely above a whisper. "Oh, Andrew, yes dear, I'm fine. I just need some rest." But the way she swayed, her hand gripping the doorknob for balance, said otherwise. Her complexion was pale, her lips dry and cracked. She was trembling. Andrew's eyes shifted back to the blood stains on her pants, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't leave. "You're bleeding," he said gently, trying to keep the alarm out of his voice. "You're not well, Mrs. Callahan. I need to call someone." No, don't bother," she muttered, waving a trembling hand dismissively. "I'll be fine. I just need to lie down." She began to close the door, but Andrew stepped forward, his hand gently pushing it open a little further. "Please, Mrs. Callahan, let me help you." For a moment she seemed to consider his words, her glazed eyes staring at the floor. Then she gave a faint nod, her body sagging against the doorframe. I can't seem to do anything." Andrew's heart broke at the sight of her. He glanced over her shoulder into the house, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The once pristine living room was a mess. Old food containers littered the floor, and dirty dishes were piled high on the coffee table. There was an unpleasant odor in the air, like something decaying, and a tinge of something even more disturbing, like the faint, metallic smell of blood. "I'm going to call for help," Andrew said firmly, pulling his phone from his pocket. "Just stay here with me, okay?" Mrs. Callahan didn't argue. She leaned back into the doorway, her breath shallow and labored. Andrew dialed 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher in quick, urgent bursts. The blood, her condition, the state of the house. The dispatcher assured him that paramedics were on the way, instructing him to keep her calm and stay with her. Andrew looked at Mrs. Callahan again, his heart pounding as he struggled to keep his voice steady. "Help is coming, Mrs. Callahan. You'll be okay." Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and she gave him a weak smile, though it quickly faded as her strength seemed to drain away. "I didn't want anyone to see me like this," she murmured. "I'm just so tired." Minutes felt like hours as Andrew stood there, watching over her. The paramedics arrived quickly, and the quiet street was soon filled with flashing lights and the sounds of hurried footsteps. Andrew stepped back as they rushed into the house, explaining what he'd seen and the condition she was in. The paramedics moved swiftly, assessing Mrs. Callahan's condition before carefully lifting her onto a stretcher. Andrew caught a glimpse of more bloodstains on her clothing and couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his gut. He overheard one of the paramedics mention severe dehydration, possible internal bleeding, and signs of untreated injuries. It was clear that she had been suffering for some time. "She's in critical condition," one of the paramedics said to the police officer who had arrived with them. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately." Andrew felt his throat tighten as the reality of the situation settled over him. Mrs. Callahan, the kind woman who always had a warm word for him, was now fighting for her life. He had known something was wrong, but the gravity of her condition shook him to his core. Before they wheeled her out, Mrs. Callahan opened her eyes once more, looking up at Andrew. She reached out with a trembling hand, and he stepped forward, gently taking it in his. "Thank you, Andrew," she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the oxygen mask. "For not giving up on me." Andrew swallowed the lump in his throat. "You're going to be all right, Mrs. Callahan. They'll take care of you." As the ambulance doors closed and sped off, Andrew stood on the porch, his heart still racing. The police officer approached him, jotting down notes and asking him a few questions about what he had seen. "You did the right thing calling us," the officer said. "She's lucky you were here. It looks like she's been in bad shape for a while." Andrew nodded, but the guilt gnawed at him. How had it gotten this bad without anyone noticing? Why hadn't he checked on her sooner? Over the next few days, Andrew couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Callahan. The image of her frail body, the blood on her clothes, and the state of her home haunted him. He had been delivering mail to her house for years, and somehow she had slipped through the cracks. On the third day, unable to bear the uncertainty, Andrew decided to visit the hospital. After explaining who he was to the receptionist and waiting anxiously in the sterile, white-walled lobby, a nurse finally led him to Mrs. Callahan's room. She lay in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped softly in the background. Her skin was pale, but she looked better. Clean, resting, and peaceful. When she saw Andrew standing in the doorway, her face lit up with a small, tired smile. "Andrew," she whispered, "you came." He stepped into the room, pulling a chair beside her bed. "Of course, Mrs. Callahan. How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said, her voice stronger than before. "But I'm alive, thanks to you." Andrew shook his head, humbled by her gratitude. "I just did what anyone would do." Mrs. Callahan squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong for someone in her condition. Not everyone would have noticed. Not everyone would have cared. She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. "I was too proud to ask for help. I thought I could manage on my own, but—" Her voice broke. "I was scared." Andrew felt a lump form in his throat. He squeezed her hand back, his voice soft. "You don't have to go through this alone anymore. We'll get you the help you need." For the next hour, they talked about her illness, about the treatment she had refused because of pride, and about the loneliness that had settled over her life since her husband passed away. Mrs. Callahan had been fighting a silent battle. Too ashamed to reach out for support, even as her health declined. As Andrew left the hospital that day, he felt a deep sense of responsibility, not just as a mailman, but as a member of her community. Mrs. Callahan had slipped through the cracks, but he wouldn't let it happen again. From that moment on, Andrew made sure to check in on her regularly, and with the support of the neighborhood, they rallied around Mrs. Callahan, ensuring that she would never be alone in her struggles again. As the weeks passed and Mrs. Callahan began to recover, Andrew realized something profound. Sometimes it's the smallest moments, the brief exchanges, the simple deliveries, that can lead to something life-changing. And for Mrs. Callahan, that change had begun with a knock on the door and a mailman who had noticed when something wasn't right. In the end, it wasn't just about delivering the mail anymore. It was about delivering hope, care, and a reminder that no one should face life's struggles alone.